The letter slipped from my fingers and drifted to the kitchen floor. I stood there staring at it, my coffee going cold on the counter, the words "power of attorney" still burning in my vision. That was 6 days before Mother's Day. My wife picked it up before I could. She read it twice, slowly, and when she finally looked at me, her face had gone the color of old ash. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Outside, a robin was going absolutely crazy in the cedar hedge, singing like nothing in the world was wrong. I remember thinking how strange that was. We've been married 41 years, my wife and I. Retired to a small house just outside of Kelowna, British Columbia, close enough to the lake that on clear mornings we could see the water from the back porch while we drank our coffee. We weren't wealthy people, not by any standard. I'd spent 30 years as a pipe fitter with a union pension, and my wife had worked part-time at a dental office until her knees gave out. We had the house, paid off. We had our RRSPs. We had enough. That word, enough, meant everything to us. We had worked our whole lives to arrive at it. Our son was 42 years old. His name is Warren. I want to be precise about that because I spent a long time in this story trying to soften things, trying to use words like struggling and going through a rough patch. And I think that kind of gentleness is exactly what got us here. So, his name is Warren. He is 42 years old, and he has never held a job for longer than 14 months. That is not an exaggeration. He married his wife Cheryl about 8 years ago. She's from the lower mainland, sharp as a tack when it suits her, and I say that not as a compliment. Cheryl has a talent for identifying what people want to hear and saying it back to them with absolute conviction. When they were first dating, she told me I reminded her of her own father, that I had a steadiness she'd always admired. I was flattered. I'm not flattered anymore. In the early years of their marriage, the requests were small, a few $100s to cover a security deposit when they moved apartments. A loan, always a loan, never a gift. They were very particular about that word, to fix the transmission on Warren's truck. My wife and I talked it over each time, agreed each time, and told ourselves it was temporary. Young people get on their feet. Young people figure it out. We'd had our own hard years in our 20s, and someone had helped us through. It felt right. But the years kept passing, and Warren kept not figuring it out. He'd start something, a renovation business, a landscaping side operation, one absolutely baffling attempt at selling supplements online, and each thing would collapse within a year, always for reasons that had nothing to do with Warren. The economy, a dishonest partner, bad timing, the market wasn't ready. He had a gift for narrative, I'll give him that. He could make failure sound like a near miss. What changed, I think, was when Cheryl started being more directly involved in the asks. Before, it would be Warren calling on a Sunday evening, that particular tone in his voice, and we'd have the conversation. After a while, it was Cheryl who called, and her calls had a different quality to them. More structured, more prepared. She knew the exact amount she was asking for before she dialed. She knew what objections we might raise and had answers ready. And then there was the grandchildren situation. They have 2 kids, a boy, 8 years old, and a girl who just turned 6. My wife loves those children in a way I cannot describe. She kept photos of them on the fridge, on the nightstand, on the little shelf above the kitchen sink. Every time we drove to visit, she'd be quiet the whole way there, just sort of vibrating with anticipation. The kids loved her back. That part was real, I believe that. Cheryl understood what those children meant to my wife. I don't think she came up with the strategy all at once. I think it developed gradually, the way mold develops, slowly, in the dark, and you don't notice it until it's everywhere. The first time she mentioned casually that it would be harder to arrange visits if things were stressful between us financially, I didn't register it as a threat. I registered it as information. That was my mistake. I filed it away as something to think about, and then I didn't think about it hard enough. By last winter, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. A request would come in. $5,000, $8,000, once $12,000 to cover what Cheryl described as a shortfall on their mortgage renewal. And if we hesitated, the children would become unavailable. Not dramatically. Nothing you could point to cleanly. Warren would text that the kids had a thing that weekend. Then another thing. My wife would sit at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand waiting for photos, and they wouldn't come. A week would pass. 2 weeks. Then a call would come in with a new number. A need, a crisis, a situation requiring immediate help. And if we said yes, suddenly the kids were available again, and there would be a photo of our granddaughter in her rain boots grinning. And my wife would put the phone down and start crying quietly, and I'd stand in the doorway, not knowing what to say. I knew what was happening. My wife knew what was happening. We had conversations about it, careful, low-voiced conversations after dinner where we go around and around and arrive at the same place. But the kids, the letter arrived in March. It came in a standard white envelope, addressed to both of us from a law office in Surrey. Inside was a document requesting that my wife and I consider granting Warren a general power of attorney over our financial affairs. The letter explained, in measured legal language, that this was a common arrangement for aging parents, that it would give Warren the ability to manage our accounts and property should we become unable to do so ourselves, that it was simply a matter of prudent planning. My wife and I are both 67 years old. We are in good health. We have our own financial advisor and our own lawyer, a woman named, well, that doesn't matter. We were not confused or incapable. We had not asked for this. We had not had any conversation that could have suggested we were considering it. I called Warren that same evening. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting the call. He said it was just something Cheryl had looked into, just the precaution, just something they thought we should have in place before we got older. He used the word just 6 times in 3 minutes. I counted. I was standing at the kitchen window watching a neighbor's dog investigate our recycling bin, and I counted every time he said just, because I needed something to hold on to while the rest of me was going very, very quiet. I told him we weren't interested and we'd be handling our own affairs as we had always done. He said he understood. He said, of course, no pressure. It had just been a suggestion. 3 days later, my wife received a text from Cheryl saying that April was going to be busy for them and visits would probably need to wait until summer. I'm 68 years old. I spent 30 years crawling through pipe chases and working in 30 weather, and I know what tools look like when someone is using them. My grandchildren were being used as tools. My wife was being operated on like a mechanism. And somewhere in the previous several years, without my fully acknowledging it, I had allowed my home to become a place where that kind of thing was possible. I called our lawyer the next morning. I did not tell my wife I was doing it. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons on the highway, and I called her from my cell, and I told her everything. All of it. The 20-plus years of loans that never came back. The pattern of financial pressure, the children being made unavailable, the power of attorney letter. I talked for nearly 40 minutes, and she listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, that I had done the right thing by calling, and that there were several things we needed to do immediately. The first thing was to change our wills. I want to explain something about this, because when people hear changed our wills, they sometimes imagine it as a punishment, a dramatic act of cutting someone off in a moment of anger. It wasn't like that. It was a slow and considered decision made over several weeks. My wife and I sat with our lawyer on 2 separate occasions and talked through what we actually wanted, what our values were, what we believed we owed our son, and what we believed we owed ourselves. It was one of the most serious conversations we'd ever had, just the 2 of us, and this woman who had been our lawyer for over a decade. What we decided was this. Warren would not receive his inheritance as a lump sum. It would go into a trust, administered by our lawyer's firm, dispersed in structured amounts over 20 years. There would be provisions for hardship, but they would require documented evidence and third-party review. The house, should we sell it, would not be accessible to anyone holding power of attorney over our affairs unless 2 independent medical professionals had assessed us as fully incapacitated. It was clean. It was careful. It was exactly what should have been done years ago. The second thing our lawyer recommended was to document everything going forward. I started keeping a log. Date, time, nature of request, what was said, any follow-up. It was a strange thing to do with your own son. Sitting at the desk in the spare bedroom, writing notes like I was filling out an incident report, but I kept doing it because my lawyer had asked me to, and because something in me had shifted. I had stopped trying to find the version of events where none of this was really happening. Mother's Day fell in May, as it always does. 3 weeks before, Warren called to say he and Cheryl were thinking of coming up for the long weekend. He said the kids had been asking about us. He used our grandchildren's names specifically, which he knew would land. He said my wife's granddaughter had drawn a picture of her at school and wanted to give it to her in person. My wife covered the phone with her hand and looked at me with an expression I'd been seeing for years. A hope so cautious that it almost stopped being hope. We said yes to the visit. The weekend before Mother's Day, a parcel arrived on our front porch. Standard cardboard shipping box, addressed to both of us, no return address, postmarked from a town in the Fraser Valley. My wife came in from the garden and saw it by the door. She looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit. A beat too long, a slight narrowing of the eyes. "Don't open it," she said. I'd already crouched down to pick it up. "What do you mean?" She was looking at the label. "I don't recognize the handwriting. And look at the postmark. That's where Cheryl's sister lives." I stood up. I looked at the box. It was about the size of a shoe box, sealed tightly with several layers of tape. It wasn't making any sound. There was no smell. "It could be anything," I said. "It could be," she said, "but I'd like to know what it is before it's open in our living room." My wife is not a dramatic person. In 41 years, I have never once known her to be dramatic. When she tells me something doesn't sit right, I have learned to believe her. I carried the box to the garage and set it on the workbench. Then I called our son. He didn't answer. I texted him to call me when he got a chance. Then I came back inside, and my wife made tea, and we sat at the table and looked at each other across our cups and didn't say the things we were thinking. He called back 2 hours later. "Did you send us something?" I asked. There was a pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have. "A Mother's Day thing," he said. "Just a little gift." "What kind of gift?" Another pause. "Just something for the yard. Why did it come already?" The something for the yard when we eventually had it opened. I called the neighbor who'd done some wildlife work and asked him to come over. Was a glass terrarium box packed with air holes and a live garter snake inside. Now, I want to be fair. Garter snakes are harmless. Lots of people keep them as pets. There is a version of this where it was a thoughtless gift, a strange impulse, nothing more. But my wife is deeply and genuinely afraid of snakes. Not in a mild way. It goes back to something that happened to her as a child on her family's property in Saskatchewan. Warren had known this his entire life. He had grown up in a house where that fear was not a secret. My neighbor stood in my garage holding the terrarium and looking at me with a careful expression. "You want me to take this?" he asked. "Please," I said. After he left, I stood in the garage for a long time. The workbench was empty. Outside, I could hear my wife in the garden, the quiet snip of her pruning shears, the sound of ordinary life continuing. I went inside and I called my lawyer. I didn't file a police report. In hindsight, maybe I should have. There is nothing technically illegal about sending someone a live garter snake through the mail, though I later looked into it, and there are in fact Canada Post regulations about shipping live animals that had not been followed. What I did instead was document it. I added it to my log. I had my neighbor write a brief description of what he'd found, and I kept that too. And then I called Warren back, and I told him, in the flattest voice I could manage, that we had found what he sent. He said he thought it would be funny. He said my wife had a great sense of humor, and he thought she'd laugh. I said, "Warren, she would not laugh." He was quiet. I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as clearly as I'm saying it. We've changed our wills. We've spoken to a lawyer about the power of attorney letter. We've been keeping records. And whatever has been happening these past several years, the money, the visits, your kids being made unavailable, it's done. Not because I don't love you. I do love you. But this is done." He started to say something, and I said, "Let me finish." I told him we were not cutting him out of our lives if he chose not to be cut out. I told him we were not angry, or not only angry. I told him that I had spent a great deal of time over the past few months trying to understand how we had gotten here, and that I didn't have a clean answer, that maybe we had made it too easy for too long, that maybe something had gone wrong before we noticed it going wrong. I told him that the door was open, but that it opened differently now. Visits without conditions, conversations without asks, a relationship that existed for its own sake rather than as a corridor to something else. I told him to think about whether that was something he wanted. He hung up without answering. Cheryl called the following evening. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was calm and professional and contained the sentence, "I think there's been a serious miscommunication and would like the opportunity to clarify." I saved the voicemail. I added it to my log. I did not call back. Mother's Day came and went quietly. My wife and I drove down to the lake in the morning and sat on a bench for a while. It was one of those May days that makes you understand why people live in British Columbia. The air clean and cool, the water very still, the mountains on the far shore holding the last of the winter snow. She didn't say much. I didn't either. At some point she reached over and put her hand on top of mine, and we sat there like that until the sun got warm enough to take off our jackets. "Are you okay?" I asked her. "I think so," she said. "Are you?" I thought about it honestly, which is something I'd been trying to do more of lately. "I think I'm getting there," I said. There is a part of this story I want to be honest about, because the comments on these videos sometimes assume that the people telling the stories are entirely blameless, and I'm not sure I am. I gave Warren the message over decades that money was how we solved problems. When he had a problem, I wrote a check because I didn't know how else to help, or because writing the check was easier than the conversation the problem actually required. I don't know if knowing that changes anything, but I know it's true and I think it matters. What I know is that I'm 68 years old, I live in a house that's paid off, my wife and I are healthy, and we still have time. Time for mornings at the lake. Time for the garden. Time for the kind of quiet that isn't the quiet of something being suppressed, but the quiet of things finally settling. Our lawyer told us at our last meeting that the trust structure we put in place was solid, that our affairs were in order, that should either of us become genuinely incapacitated, there were appropriate safeguards in place, and Warren was not among them. I thanked her and wrote her a check for her time, which I did without hesitation, which felt different from every other check I'd written in recent memory. We haven't spoken to Warren since that phone call. My wife texts the grandchildren's numbers sometimes, little messages, heart emojis, and photos of things she thinks they'd like. A particularly good sunset, the robin, who's been nesting in the cedar hedge. We don't know if they see them. We hope they do. 6 weeks after Mother's Day, a short email arrived from Warren. 4 sentences. He said he'd been thinking. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand. He said he didn't entirely understand what had changed, but that he was willing to talk if we were. I read it twice. I showed it to my wife. She read it and set her coffee cup down and looked out the window for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked me. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I think I want to take my time deciding." She nodded. She picked her coffee back up. The robin started in on his song again from somewhere in the hedge, absolutely relentless, filling the whole kitchen with something that sounded almost unreasonably like hope. I keep coming back to that letter on the kitchen floor, the one about power of attorney. I've thought about it more times than I can count, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of sober clarity that took me a long time to arrive at. What happened in our family didn't start with a snake in a box or a legal document from a Surrey law office. It started much earlier, in small moments I chose not to examine too closely. Every time I wrote a check instead of having the harder conversation, I was teaching Warren something. I was teaching him that difficulty had a price, and that I would pay it. I meant it as love. I think, in some way, it was love. But love without honesty in it eventually hollows out into something neither person recognizes. That's the part I had to sit with. Not Warren's choices. His choices were his own, and I stopped trying to carry them, but mine. The integrity I thought I was showing my son all those years wasn't always integrity. Sometimes it was avoidance, wearing a generous face. A man with real honesty in him would have said much sooner, "This isn't help, this is harm." I wasn't ready to say it. And the cost of that delay showed up eventually in a terrarium on my workbench. What I understand now at 68 is that a clear mind is not a luxury. It's the thing that protects everyone, including the people you love. When I finally sat in that Tim Hortons parking lot and called our lawyer and told her everything, I wasn't being cold or calculating. I was, for the first time in years, actually thinking straight. I was using my head instead of letting guilt do the thinking for me. And that clarity, that willingness to see the situation as it actually was, rather than as I wished it were, turned out to be the most useful thing I had. The courage part surprised me. I didn't feel brave when I called Warren and told him the wills had been changed. I felt sick, actually. My hands weren't entirely steady. But I've come to believe that's what doing the right thing often feels like when you've waited too long to do it. It doesn't arrive with confidence. It arrives despite the absence of it. My wife sat across the kitchen table from me that Mother's Day morning at the lake, and she reached over and put her hand on mine. And that steadiness between us, that willingness to keep going even through the hard parts, that was something we had built together over 41 years. No one could take it. Not even Warren. And I don't think, if I'm honest, he ever really wanted to. I don't know what happens next with my son. I genuinely don't. His email sits in my inbox, and I read it sometimes, those 4 short sentences, and I think about what answering might look like. I think about what it would require. From him, yes, but also from me. A kind of openness I haven't fully figured out how to hold alongside everything else I now know. What I do know is that my wife and I woke up this morning in our house, which is paid for, and drank our coffee on the back porch and watched the light come up over the lake. The robin was back in the cedar hedge. The mountains had lost most of their snow. It was enough. It was exactly enough.